Tēnā koutou katoa. Hei timatanga e tika ana ki te tuku whakamoemuti ki te wāhi ngaro kia whae ai tā tātou noho. Tahi kōrero tahi hoki i tēnei, tēnei ata. Nā reira he honore, he kore, he maunga rongo ki rungi te whenua whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Tukua mai te wairua me te kaha kia rere ki ngā taumata he arahi a tātou mahi. Me tā tātou whai i ngā tikanga me ngā whakapono a rātou mā. Kia mau, kia ita, kia kore ai engaro, kia pupure, kia whakamaua, kia tīna, tīna. Hui e tai ki. E te iwi, koutou i horo mai, nau mai, haere mai. Ko ai au, I'm Linda Waimarie and Nikora. I'm co-director of Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga, Aotearoa's Māori Centre of Research Excellence, and I have the extreme pleasure of joining my colleagues from the BioHeritage National Science Challenge to talk about a report released recently titled When the Crown Controls Mātauranga. The report is authored by Dr. Aroha, Te Pareake Mead, Dr. Valance Smith, Dr. James Ataria, Te Puawai Wilson Leahy, Professor Shaun Ogilvie, Irene Watene, Dr. Helen Potter, Marcus Rongwhitiao Shadbolt. The program will flow a little bit like this today. The authors will take around about 40 minutes to highlight critical points from their research, and that will be followed by a Q&A and a discussion which the authors are really keen to have with those of you who have dropped in this morning. In terms of the Q&A, please don't wait for the end. There is a little dialogue box where you can actually put questions for the panel. Please feed those in as we go. Don't wait till the end. And we'll be looking across those questions and, where appropriate, answering those questions as we go. So please don't wait for the end. Also, just wanted to ensure that it's a respectful conversation. If you're simply here to disturb and disrupt, we have ways and means of exiting you from the forum. But the critical thing is that we do want to have a conversation. It is, for some, a sensitive topic, a challenging topic, and sometimes we need to be a little bit careful in the way in which we use language, especially on platforms like this. It can be a little bit difficult. So the team is looking forward to treating kindly, and the hope is that you'll also treat kindly in terms of the Q&A session discussion, the subject matter that's before us today. So of the authorship team, we have 3 authors, plus 1 end user of the report joining us on the panel this morning. So just briefly, Aroha, Shaun, Lynell and Valance, the presenters for today's session. And I want to move to the first presenter, Aroha, whose background traverses many different fields and disciplines, and I'm sure that many of you know her work in the sector. She's a political scientist. She specialises in the contribution of Indigenous peoples to national, regional and global policy and law. She's had experience in journalism, public policy, diplomacy, senior management, governance boards, she's been an academic lecturer and a researcher, and indeed a mentor to many in the sector. She's worked in many different roles within public service, in international organisations, community groups and the voluntary sector. And her experience traverses working directly with and for local communities and at national, regional, particularly in the Pacific region, as well as international. She's been the leader of this team and indeed the lead author. So I'll turn now to Aroha and the rest of the team to proceed with the presentation for this morning. So tēnā koe, Aroha.
Tēnā koe, Linda, and thank you very much for the introduction. And welcome to all the participants of this webinar. Producing this report when the Crown controls Mātauranga has been a 2-year effort, and we're all glad and relieved to be at this stage of being able to present our findings to all of you, and I hope they will be useful in your research and endeavours. First, the publication was produced as part of the work of Te Aho Mātauranga, which is a cohort of Māori researchers and contacts who are involved in various aspects of the work program of the Biological Heritage Challenge. Although Linda has already acknowledged the authors, I'd like to take the time to do that myself. Valance Smith and Shaun Ogilvie, both of whom are contributing to today's panel. Jamie Ataria and Eri Nawatani Rawiri, who are senior challenge researchers. We were really fortunate to engage 2 early career Māori researchers, Te Pua Wai Wilson Lay, who was a legal intern at Kāhui Legal during the formative part of this study, and Marcus Shadbolt, a master's student at University of Canterbury. And finally, Helen Potter, who was lead author of the Roika Māngai Y262 guidelines, and who also contributed valuable insight in the writing of this report. I think we each brought quite different skills, perspectives and insights to this report. I'd like now to speak briefly to the motivation behind this project. What interest could the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge possibly have in this topic? As it turns out, quite a lot. So the primary motivation for the project has been our continuing exploration of the issues raised by the Y262 Treaty of Waitangi claim and the resultant tribunal report, Ko Aotearoa Tēnei. The Y262 claim is one of the largest and most complex in the history of the Waitangi Tribunal. It was also the first whole of government inquiry and the first contemporary claim that focused primarily on the Crown's existing laws, policies and practices rather than the Crown's historical actions. It required examination of the policy areas of more than 20 government agencies. Next slide. Each of us have had varied experience with the Y262 claim, both direct and indirect. So as part of the challenge, we conceptualized and delivered an in-house webinar series on Y262 and then contributed to the series convened through Roika Māngai on the history and impacts of the Y262 claim and the resultant production of the Y262 Best Practice Guide for Science Partnerships with Kaitiaki for research involving taonga. In my case, I provided evidence for the Ngāti Porou claimants during the second phase of the tribunal hearings, as well as helped to secure the international experts who provided evidence in the first phase of the hearings back in 1998. And during my time as the director of the Māori Business Program at Victoria University, my students organised a public seminar on Y262 issues for 8 consecutive years, including in 2011, the year the tribunal released its report. And in 2018, together with a group of amazing Māori women, including Lynell, Tuffery, Huria, who is speaking later in this webinar, we convened Ngā Taonga Tuku Iho, an international conference on Māori cultural and intellectual property issues, to get a sense of how Māori are faring in terms of protection and promotion of their creative and scientific works. We'd like to think that this 2018 conference helped move the Crown along in its consideration of the issues of the claim, as it announced the following year to pai tāwhiti a whole of government approach to the issues of the claim. For those of you who have not yet read the Tribunal's Y262 2-volume report, it is organised into 8 chapters. The evidence I contributed was in relation to what is now Chapter 8, the making of international instruments, participating in the development of the guidelines for scientific research, which I just described in the previous slide, came from consideration of chapters 2 to 4. This specific report focuses on the content of chapter 6, when the Crown controls Mātauranga. Next slide, please. In chapter 6, the tribunal highlighted that the Crown had intentionally damaged Mātauranga and its traditional system of transmission. The tribunal noted that every Crown agency that appeared in their inquiry, and most of those that did not, deal with Mātauranga to some extent, and somewhat provocatively suggested that the Crown is practically in the seat of kaitiaki, as some agencies are custodians of Mātauranga, some its owners, others fund it, while others are responsible for transmitting it. It was difficult to read this chapter when the report first came out. The notion of the Crown being described as a kaitiaki, a controller and owner of Mātauranga, was and is problematic in profound ways, some of which can be quite triggering. Next slide. Another motivator was that in our work with Challenge, we sit alongside Mātauranga holders. We see and experience how Mātauranga can directly contribute to reducing the decline of Indigenous biodiversity, as well as managing pests and pathogens. At one level, we believe there is a place and necessity for Mātauranga to be more widely applied, but we are acutely aware of the lack of protection mechanisms, both legal and informal, to protect Mātauranga from misappropriation and misuse, including use without free prior informed consent of knowledge holders or the sharing of benefits arising from such use. Normative standards set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and in the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which New Zealand has not ratified, require New Zealand to develop transparent protection mechanisms for Indigenous knowledge. But to date, this has not been actioned. Next slide. Turning now to methods. We decided to take the guesswork out of trying to figure out what the Crown was and wasn't doing in relation to Mātauranga since the Tribunal's report was published by conducting a survey. The Public Service Commission advised that there is no central depository that collects such information across the whole of government and suggested therefore that each department ministry would need to be contacted individually. In May 2021, a memo and questionnaire was sent out to the heads of each of the government agencies listed on the Commission's website. Responses were received over a 3-month period up to August 2021. The survey had an 84% response rate, which is very high, and I would like to take the time to acknowledge and thank the 29 agencies who responded. To clarify, of those 29 agencies, 26 were departments and ministries, and 3 were from agencies within departments. For example, Archives New Zealand, Biosecurity New Zealand, and the National Emergency Management Agency, which is part of DPMC. We, as a team, undertook 3 rounds of analysis of the responses to double check and verify accuracy of the information and that they were being collated and grouped in a consistent manner. And I just want to note that 5 Crown agencies did not respond. These were the Department of Conservation, Ministry for Pacific Peoples, New Zealand Customs Service, Oranga Tamariki, Serious Fraud Office. Next slide. So 6 questions were asked, of which 5 required quite detailed responses. The full questions are on page 8 of the report, but going through them briefly, we looked at policy. Does your department, ministry have a policy outlining how it acknowledges, interacts with and supports Mātauranga? And if yes, please share the text of that policy. Legislation, is your department ministry responsible for any legislation that includes references to Mātauranga? And if yes, please state which legislation and specify sections. Public funding. This was really to ascertain what was being done to assist Māori to record, archive and promote Mātauranga. So we asked, does your department provide any public funding to people for the express purpose of recording, archiving, utilising or progressing Mātauranga? And we asked for information about those funds. We then asked if each department administers programs, projects or activities directly related to Mātauranga. And then we looked at whether each department contributes to Mātauranga has developed indicators or a monitoring system to measure the impact that the department has or intends to have on Mātauranga. And finally, we provided a scale of self-assessment of contribution to Mātauranga, and we left it to departments to indicate where they felt they were on this 5-spectrum scale of working with Mātauranga. Next slide. The information contained in this report, therefore, was obtained directly from government departments in response to this questionnaire. It therefore provides a comprehensive overview of Crown activities relevant to Mātauranga as identified and described by them. The intention of the report was not to analyse each activity, program or policy, but rather to develop a picture of what is happening across Crown agencies relevant to Mātauranga and coming back to this essential point as described by them. What we wanted to know is, has there been progress since the Tribunal's report was released? Does the Crown now have an overarching policy outlining its role, vision and objectives relating to Mātauranga? Next slide. So early kind of learnings from our analysis is that the Crown definitely does not control Mātauranga, but it does exhibit controlling behaviours relating to Mātauranga in some instances, and we provide examples of that in the report. Is there a whole of government approach? Well, we saw no evidence of a central whole of government approach to and policy for Mātauranga. And what about at a departmental level? We found through the survey that the majority of government departments do not have policies in place to guide their interaction with Mātauranga, that there are few legislative protections in place relating to Mātauranga and none that specifically cover protection from misappropriation and or misuse. And yet, despite this lack of policies and legislation, agencies continue to undertake and initiate a wide range of initiatives, most often without assessment or monitoring frameworks in place, thereby making it difficult for any agency to provide a compelling narrative about its role and contribution to Mātauranga. Shaun will speak in more detail to the research findings, but let's pause here and reflect on a foundational issue. What is Mātauranga and what does it mean to work with Mātauranga? We did not define Mātauranga in the questionnaire, enabling each department to share their definition if they had one. But I'd like to turn over now to our next speaker, Valance Smith, to just speak a little bit more about what is Mātauranga. Thank you.
Tēnā koe Aroha. Before you pop off the screen, just want to clear away a couple of questions. So the first is from Stephen Ross. Aroha, can you please name again the international expectations / agreements around protecting Indigenous knowledge, which New Zealand is not signed up with?
The Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity.
And the second question.
Yeah.
And the second question, which is a good one from Georgina Ross, relative to responses from agencies you sent the survey to. She asked, could you OIA the agencies that didn't respond?
We could OIA, but we decided to go with a voluntary approach and we left it with departments. I mean, in the case of the Department of Conservation, it's particularly unfortunate because we were actively working with the department at the time that this information was being gathered. So it was a conscious decision not to provide the information sought, and so we have to accept that.
Kapai. Tēnā koe for brilliant overview of the report and critical things that arose from the information that was sent back. Moving now to Valance. What is Mātauranga? What does it mean to work with Mātauranga? So tēnā koe, Valance.
Tēnā koe, Linda. Hoi no tuatahi ake ka mihi atu au ki a koe. Ko koe tēnā e whakapuare tō tātou hui raro i te manaake tangata runga rawa nore rei mihi ana. Me te tautoko i o mihi ki te tini ki te mano o te rā ki a koutou katoa e mātaki take mai nei. E whakarunga mai nā ki tēnei noho tahi o tātou ki tēnei wānanga o tātou tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Valance Smith, tōku ingoa, tōku pāpā no Ngāpuhi, tōku māma no Waikato. I do appreciate that last slide that was on there. That baby turned 4 today. So hari huri tau ki taku tama aio te irirangi Cowboy Smith. Hoi anō e te whānau. So my mahi here is to just unpack what is Mātauranga Māori. How do we work with Mātauranga Māori? Why is it important? So what I've done is I've just taken one part of the report which describes Mātauranga Māori as being the cultural knowledge system of Māori that is grounded within the values, beliefs and practices of Māori and are fundamentally and inextricably linked. So I'm going to just unpack some of that. And I'll start by saying that Mātauranga is actually a modern term derived from the term or the word matau, which is a deep knowing of something. And in order to arrive to a state of deep knowing, one must first matau or matautau, which is the test, and go through some vigorous testing to arrive to a state of deep knowledge. So as a derived noun in that way, and as told to me by one of our late kaumātua, Ngā Māori Rairino, Mātauranga is validated knowledge, and as such provides a deeper understanding and wisdom of that knowledge. So it is empirical knowledge derived from the lived experiences, going back to now our beliefs, our values shape our worldview, and how we give meaningful, authentic expression to our worldview is through our tikanga and our everyday cultural practices. And to reference the wonderful Charles Royal, like any knowledge tradition of the world, it exists to explain the world, to make sense of it, to provide an orientation to our existence, to our lives, to our reality. And so how we express Mātauranga is through tikanga, our protocols. And as one of our kaumātua Pataita Marae would say, tikanga is about doing the right thing for the people at that time. Tikanga is about doing the right thing for the people at that time. And I'm just going to tell a story to help illustrate that point. Back in 2019, I attended one of my very good friends' tangihanga up in Miti, and we had already been welcomed onto the marae, and so we were on the tangata whenua side, and a couple came onto the marae, and the person, the manuhiri coming onto the marae was obviously one of my friend's workmates, high-vis vests, boots outside and so on, and the normal protocol, the normal tikanga would be the tangata whenua would stand and lead the mihi, but right from the outset, this tāne stood up straight away. So it was a breaking of that tikanga, and everyone in the room, including the young pai or the speakers, started to go, oh, what's happening here? And the kaumātua on the tangata whenua side said, oh, taihua, hang on. And so this person did his speech, and he did it with Aroha, and he sat down, and then the kaumātua from the tangata whenua side stood up And the first thing he said was, Nā te aroha I kōrero, which is, it was love that spoke. And so at that time, everyone in the room, including the young people on the pipeline who were experts in their own right, started to go, oh, okay, everything's okay now. And so so there are two lessons to that. One, tikanga is responsive, it's dynamic, it's evolving, it's relevant. Remember the right thing, remember the kōrero about tikanga is the right thing for the people at that time, so doing the right thing. So which leads to the second lesson here, which is our kaumātua, our experts have the cultural power and authority to do that. And three, as part of it, it's an applied wisdom, knowing to do something at any particular time. So remember that the paipai had a lot of gun speakers, rangatahi, but it required the kaumātua to validate a new understanding of that mātauranga, of that knowledge, of that tikanga. And so it's not so much the act of changing tikanga, it was a demonstration of a deep understanding and now wisdom of whanaungatanga and manaakitanga and being guided by those cultural beacons to navigate that space. So this is the beauty of our kaumātua. This is the lived experience of our experts. They bring a deep understanding of the complexities and sensitivities associated with Mātauranga Māori, which allows for culturally appropriate and respectful engagement with that knowledge. So it's essential that our kaumātua, our experts, and our experts can be explained in different ways, rua nuku, rua hine, tohunga, that their leadership helps to safeguard the integrity of Mātauranga Māori to keep everybody safe. Also, another part of that discussion is kōrero tukuiho, the intergenerational transmission of that knowledge as an authentic, meaningful expression of mana motuhake, of cultural agency and so on, to ensure its continued relevance and vitality within Māori communities. And just like that event in Mitimiti, that everybody is kept culturally safe. And that really can only happen upon the wisdom and learned knowledge and experience of our experts. And that is why we need to put tapu in place. We need to put measures in place to safeguard and actively protect Mātauranga, granting control and centering Māori voices so that Mātauranga Māori continues to be, circling back now to our description, grounded within the beliefs, values and practices of our tupuna. Nō reira, ko tēnei taku pahu mō tēnei wā, an explanation of what I think Mātauranga Māori is, but also I think that it actually does resonate with dimensions of the report as well. Hoi no kātera mō ko anō I tēnei wā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koe, Valance. I think we're going to go back to the slideshow. Thank you. We've had Aroha doing a brief background to the report, the motivations for the research, some of the methods that we use. Valance contexting quite nicely and neatly the question around what is Mātauranga, why is it important, why is it valuable, and why are we concerned about it. Moving now to Professor Shaun Ogilvie to look at key messages from the report. So tēnā koe, Shaun.
Tēnā koe Linda, tēnā koutou katoa, he tino mihi ki a koutou kua tau mai nei ki tēnei hui rorohiko. Ko ai au, ko Shaun Ogilvie tuku ingoa, he Huria au no te arawa me Ngāti Awa ahau. So I just wanted to start by just acknowledging Aroha. One of the things she mentioned is that we had a 84% response rate from the Crown agencies. I think that's a pretty high response rate, and we're pretty pleased with that. And I think a lot of that comes actually down to Aroha and the mana that she kind of brought to this project. So I wanted to start by doing that. I also wanted to say that there's a lot in this report. There's a lot of fruit in this report, and we've kind of with the limited time that we've got with for this webinar, I feel like I've kind of pulled out some of the key points, but I really would recommend that you kind of take time out to read the report closely and see the kind of bigger picture that we haven't really got enough time to fairly represent here. So I just want to say it as well. So my role within the webinar today is to delve into a little bit more detail around some of the key messages and the results that came out of the survey. So if we can jump onto the next slide. So the responses from the survey are really summarized here in this table that's in the report. And so Aroha talked earlier about the 5 areas where the 5 areas of questions that were sent out to each of the agencies, and they covered policies that agencies have, legislation they have, public funding that they put towards Mātauranga, projects and programs that they have around Mātauranga, and also if they have internal ways of monitoring what they're doing. And then the final thing was around the self-assessment. So that was each of the agencies giving themselves a score rating from 1 to 5 around their role around within Mātauranga. So to summarize, this table here kind of visually summarizes what came out of that. And I think the first key message is that, as you can see from the dots kind of being all over the show and, you know, missing in places, etc., there's clearly no central whole of government approach and policy for Mātauranga. So it was the kind of first overarching thing that came out, and Aroha's mentioned that too. Out of interest, only 2 of the 29 Crown agencies that responded covered all of the 5 areas, so put dots all the way across, and they were the Ministry of Education, and they've also self-assessed themselves at a 5, which I think is probably fair, and the DIA, the Department of Internal Affairs, which you'll see on the table there, self-assessed themselves at a 3, which maybe might have been a bit mean, but anyway. But the majority, 21 of the 29, did not have any relevant legislation to guide their Mātauranga related work. There were few legislative protections in place for Mātauranga Māori, and there were, in terms of funding opportunities, kind of the way we assessed it was, there's really not that many funding opportunities available for the express purpose of furthering Mātauranga Māori or archiving and recording it for future use by kaitiaki. So this is looking at it from the point of view of kaitiaki, which is really important. We also found there are a few assessment or monitoring frameworks. I think 10 out of the 29 had a specific assessment or monitoring framework where they could measure the contribution that their agencies had made towards supporting Mātauranga Māori. And we kind of came to the conclusion that the level of collaboration across the agencies, so this cross-agency collaboration, really hasn't improved much since the Ko Aotearoa Tēnei report was produced. So almost none of the recommendations that are in Chapter 6 of the Ko Aotearoa Tēnei report have been implemented by government. So kind of sounds not very positive, but I think the point here within putting this report and this research project together was really to look at positive future ways of advancing the Crown agency support for Mātauranga. And so if we jump onto the next slide, it kind of puts us into a place where takes us back to the Waitangi Tribunal report, and noting that a way forward really is around the Crown's active protection of Mātauranga. So there needs to be an overarching policy for all the agencies to use, really directed from at the higher Crown level, that involves active protection. So Mātauranga Māori is authoritatively the knowledge system of Māori, and as was stated by the Waitangi Tribunal, there can be no doubt that Te Reo and Mātauranga Māori are highly valued and irreplaceable taonga for New Zealand. These taonga exist nowhere else. The Crown has a duty to actively protect these taonga. So that conceptualisation of active protection really comes from the Waitangi Tribunal's statement. And as I said, it's kind of an important way forward in this space. Just noting that some of the idioms that were used by in the Tribunal's report, such as Crown control of Mātauranga And I guess the title of this talk, you know, when the Crown controls Mātauranga, and the title of the report, which is quite provocative. Yeah, they are quite provocative, but in some ways not really useful for clarifying what the Crown's role should be. And that role really should be providing active protection. So policies developed to control are fundamentally different from those developed to actively protect. I think that's a really important, yeah, the difference between controlling and actively protecting is probably a key message that we'd like to put across here, and we'd like to kind of spend some more time discussing towards the end of the webinar. So a principled partnership approach that the tribunal refers to could work for Māori and the Crown to co-develop legislation, policies, and programs, but it would not work, for instance, to assert Crown control over tangible and intangible manifestations of Mātauranga, or Crown attempts to codify tikanga or open access to Indigenous flora and fauna without first safeguarding Māori rights and interests. So there needs to be a process for safeguarding the Māori rights and interests. And for me, that process, I really kind of look from a kaitiaki perspective as a key way to kind of see how that might operate and be implemented effectively. So it moves us on to the next slide. So in terms of the Crown's role in active protection, what really a future way forward is really around the Crown and Māori co-developing a policy of active protection of Mātauranga, and having such a policy that's co-developed has a lot of positive attributes. It would provide clarity and direction to both the Crown and Māori, would enable the Crown to proceed in a deliberative rather than ad hoc manner. So the nature of the table of the results that I presented a couple of slides back, it kind of shows each of the agencies really working for their own means, and so it's kind of almost organically has become quite ad hoc. So this would be by having this this co-development of a policy that we could get away from that ad hoc kind of ways of for each of the agencies to proceed. It would provide transparency and accountability of government resourcing priorities and expenditures. It also enhance Māori exercise of mana motuhake and kaitiakitanga in relation to Māori biocultural heritage. So again, this report has been done under the umbrella of the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge. So we really have a focus around those biological, the biological heritage taonga that are key. But also enable the use of relevant Mātauranga for the benefit of te tai ao and for social and cultural well-being, with the consent and full participation of Māori. I think a key concept here too is that it allows a way forward around that co-development that kind of gives a vision to a future New Zealand that's kind of inclusive and respectful of Mātauranga, and also going to a global level, it would enable a more informed Crown position in terms of relevant international negotiations, and yeah, as kind of also has been visited earlier by Aroha. So we jump on to the next slide, taking us back to the Y262 claim and where that's kind of got to today. In terms of the claimants, the energy around the claim it's been such a long time since the claim was put in back in 1992. So we're talking about 30 years ago from last year, or from the time that our report was put out. It's been 30 years, and in that time, you know, there's been an intergenerational change from the claimants. And so Te Taumata Whakapumo is the Y262 legacy whānau that have taken over the mantle from the original claimants, and they're working on. They put together an engagement framework, which is here in this illustration. And so the engagement framework was really designed around Y262, and this kind of same principles apply for the nature of the engagement framework. Really also does apply for the future of Mātauranga. And really the key reason for putting this up here is to show that from a kaupapa Māori perspective, the engagement with the Crown is really just a small part of the bigger picture. So most of the effort and actual fact around Mātauranga and how Mātauranga is appropriately cared for is really, most of the effort is really Māori to Māori engagement. And it's within and across generations. So this diagram here really neatly puts into perspective that, you know, that there needs to be that kind of active protection around Māori doing things in a way that Māori want to do it. So Māori control over Māori things. And the majority of the effort rests with Māori across all spheres of our lives, at the individual, whānau, marae, hapu, iwi, Māori land trusts, wānanga, Māori businesses, and other levels of Māori interest. So that illustrates the bigger picture really, and the role that the Crown plays, which is a relatively small role in protection of Mātauranga. It really fits with Māori to have control over Māori things. Kia ora koutou katoa.
Tēnā koe, Shaun. Just going back to the questions, lots of questions there around method, around who participated, who didn't participate, some jaw drops in the question boxes in relation to some of the findings that you as the team came up with. I think we've covered most of the questions that have come through. And so I want to segue now to bring Lynell into the conversation. So tēnā koe, Lynell. Lynell, let's hope the bio is up to date, still working for Kāhui Legal?
Right.
Yeah, so Lynell was the first Māori patent attorney and is recognised as an expert on Indigenous intellectual property rights and Māori intellectual property and trademark protection. And so Lynell joins the conversation as an end user, but also as someone who's got her eyes across the government sector and the ways in which the government sector is treating with Mātauranga Māori. So tēnā koe, Lynell, over to you.
Tēnā koe, Linda. O te rā, tēnā koutou katoa. Tautoko ana au i ngā mihi kua mihia. Ki te tangata whenua, ki ngā mate, ki ngā kaikōrero o tēnei kaupau, kia koutou katoa i whakarongo mai, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Waio, he uri tēnei no te Aotea waka ko Ngāti Runui, ngā rohine, ngā rauru, ngā iwi, i ngāri, i tipu aki au ki Porirua, i raro i te maru o Ngāti Tua Rangatira. Ko Lynell Tuffery Huria tōku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So kia ora koutou, it's lovely to be part of this conversation. I am still at the moment a partner at Kāhui Legal, and as Linda mentioned, my area that I primarily work in is intellectual property. And a big part of the mahi that I do is assisting clients to navigate this intersection between Mātauranga Māori and the intellectual property system, and addressing some of the clashes that we see, the acquisition of intellectual property rights that overlap with Mātauranga Māori, and the lack of this protection, recognition or acknowledgement of Mātauranga Māori as part of that process. And so we advise a range of clients. I advise tangata whenua, so iwi and Māori. We also advise tangata tiriti who are trying to navigate and do the right thing and navigate this, this intersection or clash, as I sometimes call it. We also receive a lot of requests from Crown entities, from non-Crown entities that perform Crown functions, from entities who oversee or regulate professions that work within Crown entities or within Crown agencies. So we are sort of at the forefront of trying to advise on how these organisations can perform this role of their role in terms of active protection of Mātauranga Māori. As has been mentioned several times in this webinar, there is a real need for clarity around a high-level position on Mātauranga Māori, but there is also a real need for those frameworks to give effect to that role of the Crown performing its role as an active protector of Mātauranga Māori. And I do want to refer back to some of the other words within other chapters within the Y262 report, in particular chapters 1 and 2, which focused on the overlap between the intellectual property system and Mātauranga Māori. And a couple of key statements that I always refer to talk about how it is our role to protect Mātauranga Māori because our culture and heritage, our Māori culture and heritage, because that's how we protect our Māori culture and identity. But that's also important because that's how we protect New Zealand's culture and identity. And so there is a very strong obligation on all of us to protect and actively protect Mātauranga Māori. And another key statement in the other sections in the report is that the obligation is not just to protect, but it's also to ensure that the relationships between kaitiaki and Mātauranga Māori flourish, and that those relationships flourish as a matter of national interest. So again, reinforcing this idea that we all have this obligation to protect, actively protect, not just when we have our crown hats on, or not just when we have our tangata whenua hats on, but whenever we have any hat on. And so we all need to be thinking about this all the time. And so therefore, as I mentioned before, the need for some additional frameworks, some frameworks that are going to help navigate and ensure that Mātauranga Māori and our cultural heritage is protected, including frameworks around things like free and prior informed consent, which we hear a lot about, which does require building capacity and capability for Māori, which Shaun touched on is happening at the moment through Te Taumata Whakapūmau, ensuring that they have capability and capacity to provide and answer a question around a consent, can also have the capacity and capability to address and answer a request for an access and benefit sharing agreement that may come up. And so what we are looking for is, as I mentioned, not just that high level framework, but the detailed frameworks, those detailed frameworks, including things like whether we do need a national body that can help certify or regulate the relationship, and when we are working with Mātauranga Māori, frameworks around that deal with non-compliance that might happen when we don't protect Mātauranga Māori. What are we going to do about that? We need some frameworks that help us to address those situations. We need frameworks to assist Indigenous communities, like I said, to engage with the processes, including free and prior informed consent and access and benefit sharing agreements. We also need to make sure that those benefit sharing frameworks are fair and meet international standards. And we have, as Aroha mentioned before, the Nagoya Protocol, which can assist with enabling us to meet those national standards. And so my comments here are going to be very brief. And in summary, I just want to reflect on the fact that, one, we have this high level issue that needs to be addressed, but we also need to be dealing with that detail, and this needs to happen quickly. The Y262 claim was filed in 1991, and we're now in 2023, and we're still having this conversation. We see that Crown has not made a lot of progress in this space. And so there is still plenty of mahi to do. So kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui. Kia ora tātou katoa.
Tēnā koe, Lynell, and thank you for that overview, and also that urging and exciting of people to continue to contemplate what needs to be done in this particular domain. I want to full circle back round to Aroha, who, having run through the presentations, may have some summary comments to make before moving into Q&A.
Kia ora, and thank you to all of my fellow presenters. I want to acknowledge that this photo is of the Kāhui rangatira of Te Tira Whakamātaki, an amazing group of rangatira who do incredible work, and they also contribute to the oranga stream of the Biological Heritage Challenge. But their words and their advice and guidance sort of continually shapes a lot of the thinking around these issues. So I just want to stress that the emphasis taken in this report really has been about self-description, self-identification by Crown agencies. We've gone to considerable lengths not to put words in their mouth, but to let what they shared with us through the survey speak for itself. We didn't include additional initiatives that departments might have missed in their responses. For instance, MB gave an incredibly comprehensive response, but the work of IPONS, the Intellectual Property Office of New Zealand, which administers the Trademarks Act, the Patents Act, and they do have work that is fully relevant to Mātauranga. That's not reflected in here, but we didn't see the purpose of the report as trying to capture everything. It was really capturing how government departments describe themselves at a particular point in time. And that's both the value and the limitations of the report. But I'd just like to come back to a point Shaun raised in his slides and really lead the discussion there. Our fundamental message in doing this work is just to say that the policies that you develop to control and regulate something, in this case Mātauranga, are fundamentally different, radically different to policies that should be developed to actively protect. And I can't stress enough how important it is for Crown officials working in this area to kind of move their mindset away from controlling, regulating, feeling that that the Crown's role is central to this, but move to a different place where you see the Crown's role as being supportive, enabling, empowering, assisting, but not fundamentally leading this work. That is the work of Māori control over Māori things. And so I'd like to open it up to questions.
Aroha, just on that last point, which I think is a really, really important point, can you give an example?
An example of
how the Crown should, I guess, articulate itself as a partner in active protection as opposed to a partner in active control. Is there an exemplar out there that you can think of?
Well, through the survey, I'd have to say no. There's no exemplar out there. It really is a fundamentally different mindset. But this is where we need to move to if we're to do this well. What I would add to that, and I'd invite my fellow panelists to make comment as well, is that it's not that difficult, really. If the Crown could just get itself into this place of seeing itself as an enabler rather than as a controller, it offers incredible opportunities to do really innovative things with Māori and regarding Māori policy. But I think more than that, there's a hope that it will bring humility in being able to recognise that it's not a good thing for a government to be trying to control a knowledge system of a people that it's subjugated for a long period of time. And for all that has happened in the history of Māori and the treaty and where we're at as a country, that is just not a direction we want to see moving forward. It has to be fundamentally shifting from that.
And maybe I can just pick up on a question that Narangi Walker has made. She says, how do groups that you just mentioned in the presentation, Māori, get involved? The challenge is getting the Crown to actually broaden how they do business with us. Whānau hapu iwi Māori, rōpū Māori, lots of people who whakapapa are struggling to get to their places to increase their own sense of identity, their kaitiakitanga, etc. How can we increase the direct resource of Māori to increase mana kaitiakitanga and I guess to play our part in terms of Mātauranga Māori?
Kia ora Ngārangi, kia ora niece. Nice to hear from you. You know, in my social media account, every weekend, the pages are flooded with photographs of hui and wānanga that are going on at Marae all across the country. I would say that Māori are incredibly active and energetic in the space of reclaiming and just getting on with the business of being Māori. I think people would be surprised at the energy level, because I know just from what I see, all the hui for, you know, whakapapa hui, wānanga about waiata, learning karanga, learning te reo, they are packed. They're absolutely packed. And it's in every part of the country, Māori getting on with being Māori. We obviously need to scale that up, to give it better resources. And this is another way in which the Crown could really reflect on its role, moving away from that controlling side to an enabling side is actually a shifting of emphasis of policies. It's a shifting of funding to enable more activity to occur at the local level, which is where it should happen. But I'll pass over to some of my other panelists who I'm sure also have things to say on this.
Kia, I might just jump in there. Absolutely agree with your response, Aroha. It's about our communities and what those community-led research actually look like. We currently, within our National Science Challenge project, work with the whānau from Te Rarawa, and we are very clear that the research that we're engaging with them is led by the whānau from Te Rarawa, because we know that as soon as our project finishes, while we are going to have an ongoing relationship with the whānau from Te Rarawa, it's about what's that intergenerational sustainability of that knowledge to address some of the things that are going on with that community. And I'm talking within the context of Kauri Dieback. So it needs to be community-led. How can we support those communities that are doing that mahi? An example of that is every Saturday morning, one of the whānau goes to the markets in Kaitaia for a sausage sizzle, just so they can have enough resources to afford to buy whatever they need to for their rongoa. And it's those types of things that we need to, you know, those are inequitable circumstances. So how can we support those things as well? I suppose back to your original question, Linda, in terms of is there any examples out there where it is actually working? I think the mahi that you and the whānau ngā pai o te maramatanga, you're an example of that. You know, Māori-led research by Māori for Māori for the betterment of Aotearoa whānau. So there are examples out there that we can actually use as proxies or models to be able to follow, you know, successful models as well. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Valance, and perhaps just staying with you, there are lots of Māori who have been appointed to or end up situated in government sector jobs, and non-Māori taking up government sector jobs that are described as requiring knowledge, experience in terms of Mātauranga Māori. I mean, can anyone work in the area of Mātauranga? Do they need special skills, or is it just, can we go to university and do 101 Mātauranga and that's adequate? Pēhea o whakaaro.
Ka hoki aku whakaaro ki ngā mahi o runga marae. As we know, not everyone can just stand up and speak and represent the whānau. While you might have a degree of reo, that doesn't mean you have the wisdom and applied knowledge to apply that wisdom, that mātauranga. So the answer to your question is you actually need to have a long lived experience of tikanga, of te ao Māori, to be able to meet some of the expectations of you that you're required to do in your mahi. If you don't, that's okay, but you need to surround yourself with people that do have that knowledge and also acknowledge them appropriately, not as cultural advisors, but actually bring them on, acknowledging their time appropriately. We're all getting paid for our mahi, and if we're bringing in knowledge experts, they need to be acknowledged appropriately as well. But again, not as advisors and so on. How can we actually acknowledge our whānau appropriately?
Perhaps others may want to make a comment on that question.
Well, I'll join the kōrero. So I think it's really important, moving back into the Crown space, that people are able to distinguish a job description where they are told that they have to do work around mātauranga, as in develop a program and implement a program and talk about that program. That's not the same as being an expert in mātauranga. To be an expert in mātauranga, as Valance has said, requires that whole grounding in culture, in reo, in tikanga. So if we can just agree to not use the term expert in relation to mātauranga, as described by Crown agencies of the work that they do. I say that because I have been to meetings with Crown officials who have described themselves as being an expert in mātauranga. What their expertise is in implementing programs, and that's not the same. But that nuance is more than a nuance. It's incredibly important to us, to Māori, that those who don't have the expertise are clear about the boundaries of what they can and can't do.
Okay, and just staying with you, Aroha, is your report saying that the Crown should stop any mātauranga related work until the whole of government mātauranga policy has been developed? Is that what you're saying in this report, that the Crown needs to stop, needs to do the work to get clarity, to get buy-in, so that there's a whole of government wraparound policy, everyone knows which way they should be marching? Are you saying stop Crown until you've got your policy in place?
Okay, I'm gonna answer this in a complicated way. First of all, I want to say that coming back to the point that we didn't define mātauranga in the questionnaire, and we really left it up to departments to interpret it as they wished. What we found in the responses that we got is that quite a lot of the activities or the pieces of legislation that were identified by departments weren't technically mātauranga related. You could put them more in the camp or in the area of like Māori responsiveness. And that was quite a common feature, and I'd say that that raises an issue in itself of showing a lack of clarity around what is Mātauranga and how is that different to say what is a department's strategy for better engagement with Māori. So when the two get tied up as if they're one and the same, that tells us that there isn't clarity around the specific topic, the specific dynamic of Mātauranga. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is that it was really interesting to see how departments did respond to the questionnaire, because some were, gave it a very cursory response. Others, because in the letter we invited departments to contact us if they wanted to talk further about the report, and some departments did do that. And I think they really welcomed the space to be able to talk about what they want to do within the departments. And that was, really good to see that there is a genuine wish in many departments to do something and to do it well. But then we come back to this other point that without a policy, without a vision, without any notion of why you are engaging in this space, it's really difficult to move with confidence and to have traction and to be able to say from year 1 to year 5, this is what we've achieved. We've started here, to even have a notion of a baseline of what it is that you're wanting to achieve in Mātauranga and then measure that over time. It's just not there. So are we saying stop? We're certainly saying just pause, for goodness sakes, pause and reflect, because busyness does not equate to effectiveness, nor does it equate to being a good treaty partner. To be a good treaty partner requires a deliberative action and being able to sit down with Māori and work out together what you both should be doing would be a far more useful way of moving forward. We've said in the report that when we're asking for this development of a Mātauranga policy, we're not even saying it has to be called a Mātauranga policy. It could sit within a broader context of a policy around taonga, for instance, because we're really aware that Mātauranga doesn't sit in isolation. It's not a tangible thing that you can extract and just say this is Mātauranga. It sits with people, it sits with communities, it sits with places, it sits with within our species, within our biodiversity. It's a complex knowledge system, and you have to be. We just want agencies to be far more focused and more deliberative and more wanting to really make a difference in a positive and constructive way. Did I answer that question?
I think you did, and I'm going to put a question to Lynell as a follow-up in some respects. So, in your work as an IP lawyer, Lynell, you must see a wide range of clients wanting to do something relating to Mātauranga, businesses as well as government departments, etc. Is the level of interest rising? And do you think there's enough guidance, resources for people to go to for advice?
The level of interest is absolutely rising, and I think certainly after the questionnaire for this report went out, it increased, as it obviously increased. I don't think there is enough resources, but I think they are improving, and this Science Challenge has produced some wonderful resources that are available for people to access and read to help guide them when they are working with Mātauranga Māori. But there are many others. But it is, the problem, one of the issues, well, it's not an issue, it's just one of the things we need to deal with is, you know, Mātauranga, it is such a complex body of knowledge. As Aroha touched on, it's part of our taonga, and there are lots of different considerations. There are, you're dealing with different whānau hapu iwi, different kaitiaki, different taonga have, where there's different levels of interest. It's not a one-stop shop, and so it is difficult to have one framework that will fit every particular situation. And so it does need to be carefully considered in each situation because they will be different. And I think that's what people find really difficult, is they want a model, a framework that is going to, sort everything out for them. But unfortunately, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be very nuanced, and we are going to have to work through these differences over time, and that will only happen over time.
Tēnā koe, Lynell. I want to pick up on a question that Stephen Ross is asking, and I guess it relates somewhat to my comment about 101 Mātauranga. He asked the question about who can learn Mātauranga has implications for how NCEA and the Ministry of Education are positioning Mātauranga Māori in the recent NCEA review and the curriculum refresh. So I guess, Valance, in my mind, that can be responded to relative to what is Mātauranga, what is mōhiotanga, and the like. But perhaps I'll throw it to you, Valance, to see if you've got a response.
Can I jump in on that one, just real quickly?
Yes, sure. Go, Shaun.
I think that it's a really good question, Stephen. It's a really, really good question. And for me, when I read that question, it actually took me to, I've been involved with helping one of the really large local high schools here in Ōtautahi in Christchurch around this very issue. And I think it goes deeper than the question around who can learn Mātauranga, but actually gets into, in some ways more importantly, who can teach Mātauranga. And I got a fairly, I've had a fairly impassioned conversation with 30 science faculty teachers at one of the big high schools here in Christchurch. They're really feeling in a very uncomfortable place because the way the curriculum's kind of been pushed forward for them is that they find themselves in a position where they feel almost forced to have to teach into the space of Mātauranga, where they feel that they don't actually have the right to be doing that. And so there's a lot of discomfort. It's an excellent question, because I think that this is a really good example of us pushing back to the idea around having a pause and having a really serious think about how the powers that be are putting people in situations that really aren't appropriate around Mātauranga. And I think that's a really good example of that. So that was kind of where the discussion went to with those faculty staff members, and they're kind of feeling their way a bit about what an appropriate way forward is, in a manner that's actually going to be fair to Mātauranga, in all honesty, fair to Māori. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess my response doesn't come up with a solution, but I think it's something that really needs to be paused upon and thought about.
Tēnā koe, Shaun. Valance, you got a comment there?
Yeah, totally agree, Shaun. And it is a good question. And I might actually take this question within the context of tertiary education. So as universities, and we are Crown entities, therefore we need to be responsive to our commitments and obligations to honouring Te Tiriti in our environment. And so that's enshrined in the National Education Learning Priorities, one of which says that we need to meaningfully incorporate Te Reo Tikinga Mātauranga Māori in our curriculum. And it's that meaningful part, which is the part that everyone is grappling with. And I think that actually resonates with something that Lynell mentioned earlier on, which is that resource. There aren't nearly enough of our experts or cultural leaders to be able to service this huge need in the tertiary sector, indeed the secondary school sector, indeed industry. So that tells us that there needs to be some resource invested into growing our own. Yes, back into our communities, but what other ways and pathways can we support the development of Māori to lead these spaces? And back to the other part of that question, who should lead the space or who should teach it, should absolutely be Māori leading these spaces. And it comes back to 4 different parts. 1, cultural authenticity, cultural integrity. The second part of that is it's an opportunity also for ourselves to exact our cultural agency and self-determination, not separate from, but alongside our tiriti partner. 3, kōrero tiku iho, intergenerational transmission, and ensuring that the cultural integrity is accurate as we transfer that knowledge. And the last one is cultural sensitivity. So that's that part about ensuring that if we've got those things in place, then others who want to come into the discussion of Mātauranga Māori are kept culturally safe. And so that's not only keeping everyone culturally safe, but that's also keeping our Mātauranga culturally safe as well.
Well, I think that actually covers about 10 questions that I asked in the Q&A session. And so I'm just looking at the time. We've got around about 10 minutes before we conclude. But one of the things I would like to do is actually leave the presenters to perhaps make final comments. So perhaps just a final comment from you all, and perhaps if we can start with Shaun, circling around and concluding with Aroha.
I think for me, I just wanted to, I guess, do a mihi to Aroha again. I think the process that we went through really came from her experiences firsthand with Y262, and I think having Aroha there and having been involved intimately with those processes has brought a lot of others of us up to speed with where things are at with that, and allowed a method for us to really more deeply explore the chapter 6 within the Ko Aotearoa Tēnei report. So I just wanted to finish off with a mihi te Aroha, and again, just recommend to everyone to have a good deep read of the report, because there's a lot of valuable stuff in there. And if it sends you to going back and reading Ko Aotearoa Tēnei, especially that chapter 6, then please do that, because there's a lot of really valuable answers in that body of work. So kia ora koutou.
And to Lynell.
Kia ora. Tautoko those comments, Shaun. I guess just reflecting on that, and then reflecting back to the original claimants and the Y262 claim, and thanking them, I think, for their vision, because we're still having these conversations now, and if it wasn't for that vision, we may not have been. So just I want to acknowledge them, and I think there's many more conversations to come following this. So kia ora tātou.
Tēnā koe. Valance.
Me pē whera te kōrero ai tautoko marika hau ki te mihi kia koe, Aroha, ko koe te tuhi marei kuru e kōkiri nei tēnei kaupapa o tātou. Again, thank you, Aroha. Also, while I'm here, thank you also, Linda, for carrying our conversation this morning. E mihi ana ki a koe te kai kawe kōrero. In terms of closing thoughts, I think I just go back to what Aroha suggested to everyone, which is to take a pause. And what that pause might look like, it might look like just unweaving what you currently have, taking a good look at it, being very clear about what you want to do, alongside that having a clear definition of what Mātauranga Māori means, and then start weaving something back together a lot more tighter. So it's not disregarding the whakapapa of mahi that you've done to date, but it's about unweaving some of that and incorporating something with more integrity, something with more meaning, so that when you weave it back together again, it's a lot more tighter and stronger.
Tēnā koe. Valance. Aroha.
Kia ora. Well, thank you all for for all that you've brought to this panel. It's been really interesting, if I must say so. I guess what I want to say, and maybe this will not go over well with some people, but we've got to see this within a broader context of the global experience Indigenous peoples have had of colonisation, of living through the experience of governments deliberately marginalising people, culture, language, tikanga, customs, mātauranga. And then now we're coming through this, and suddenly there's this huge embrace of wanting to have mātauranga. But let's be really clear that we still live in a society that has problems around racism. We hear it every day in the news. We hear it through our politicians. We hear it on talkback radio. We see it in the newspapers. It's everywhere. So we're not yet at a place where we can just enthusiastically promote mātauranga as a knowledge system that everyone should know and everyone should have access to. We are not there. We are not at that place yet. If you were to talk to people like my father, who's very inclusive when it comes to mātauranga, and who's like, I'm far more risk adverse than he is. His first place would be, it needs to be shared. It isn't mātauranga unless it is shared. And my generation is saying, well, just wait a minute, before you share, you've got to have all these protocols in place. But I would like us to evolve as a nation to get to that point where we can share without it being a painful experience. But until we get there, we do need to be more reflective. I think the question that Stephen raised and the responses both from Valance and Shaun kind of highlight that issue of when the Crown might think it's doing a good thing, but because it hasn't conceptualized what its role is, it's actually transferring risk to others because it hasn't fully thought through the implications of going there. And when there's a backfiring of a pro-Māori policy, we don't see a lot of government agencies coming in behind and saying, wait a minute, that's not right. They tend to leave Māori to have to deal with those problems ourselves and with the backlash ourselves. So yes, pause, please pause and think carefully of how best to move forward so that it's a constructive and positive experience for everyone, and particularly for Māori. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Aroha. And so it's just left to me to thank the panel for participating in today's session and for all your hard research in relation to asking people to respond and then trying to make sense of the responses that they've made in a way that is kind and generous, but is also critical and insightful. So thank you for the report. It's a wake-up call. It's a report that is a stimulus for the sector, and by no means am I expecting that this team here is now going to go off and do the hard yards in terms of writing the policy for the sector. That is something perhaps falls more firmly on the shoulders, perhaps of those people who are participating and coming into the seminar today. And so turning to them, we recognise that there are many people from different government agencies, Crown agencies across the sector who have joined us today. So thank you for blocking up your time and taking an interest. I guess the request now is what do they do? What can participants do? And I think that, one first step is connecting, and so, that step's been taken today in terms of connecting to researchers to this particular report, but also connecting with others within organisations and across sectors to begin to emerge some next steps along the way. So kia koutou e mātakitaki mai nei tēnā koutou. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to conclude very, very simply by simply saying haere atu koutou mārunga i te rangimaria me te aroha Māori ora kia koutou katoa. And if I can just ask the presentation team to stay on while our participants leave the room. We could perhaps just go to mute and close we can for the moment.
Good up.